Thanks for joining us here at the
Sure.
Medtech conference.
Happy to do it.
Yep. Jim Welch, and you're a senior Medtech leader in EY?
I am Global Medtech Leader for EY. I've been doing that for a few years.
And how long has that report been coming out?
It's been coming out for 13 years. Started in 2007. Okay. So we've seen quite a few changes here and there between now and then.
And people wait for that to come hot off the press.
They do.
And it was released last night?
This morning.
This morning.
Yeah.
Any surprises or anything we should be interested in keeping an eye on?
Well, I think the things that were interesting to me, one, we knew the industry was going to perform well over the course of the year. I mean, all the signs were there. So the growth, now well over 400 billion, the way we measure it with US and European, mainly is the concentration. That's tremendous, 7.5% growth, almost close to that. So that's all great news from the industry perspective. What we focused on last year's report was the question related to R&D spending and where is that headed. It headed down significantly last year, and we were looking for whether that was going to become a trend or was it just a bit of an anomaly. Good news was it went up 11% this year.
Wow.
So while that in itself is not a trend either, it does indicate that the capital allocation of the larger medtechs is becoming a little bit more balanced back to R&D.
So when I hear a number like that, and I think about the world we're in right now in medtech especially, do you use that signal against the M&A activity that's going on? Because some of the large strategics aren't putting as much money into their spend, unless you're Intuitive, of course.
Yes. True.
Where their quarterly spend is gross sales out of most companies.
Yes, it is.
Right?
Yes, it is.
200 million a quarter or something.
Is it? Oh,
I don't know what it is.
Yeah.
But do you at least bang that against the M&A numbers that are out there? Do you at least give that consideration?
Absolutely, without a doubt. So those are the two drivers from an innovation standpoint. Now M&A, based on how we time the report, the numbers can be high or low based on where the deal lands in the calendar. This year it's been, other than GE Danaher, a lot of smaller deals, tuck-in deals, technology-based deals, database deals. So the combination of the two I think is really encouraging from that standpoint.
So a rolling 3-year average would be more interesting to look at.
It was, yeah, and that's the way, when we walk back a little bit and look at the trends. Now the other difference is since 2015, the cash return to shareholders has gone up as well. So it's really balancing M&A and R&D with cash return to shareholders and making sure that is there enough money being pumped back into the business and innovation to support future growth, not just short-term returns. But as you know, R&D is not just in R&D spend. It's in partnerships, it's in technology alliances, it's in other things just other than that.
Yeah. How is E&Y looking at, we're in this digital world we're moving into, in relative terms pretty quickly, right? The classic S-curve, as I refer to, right? We've got the birth and then we got the early adoption and maturity and saturation. We're just first inning or two here.
Absolutely.
And for the very first time, Medtech is really looking outside of Medtech. So a 510K or a PMA might not be an investment we care about. We might be acquiring tech that we plug into our platforms. Mm-hmm. And so those are non-Medtech companies now coming into that ecosystem.
Yeah.
What's your observation on that, and what will you be keeping your eyes on in that area?
Well, it's interesting. The companies that get the most attention, Joe, are ones that are in the technology space, right? I think there's a whole host of things happening around data and digital, from consumer products, from hospitality, from transportation. So we're looking at it more than just technology companies and medtech. We're looking at it all industries and medtech, and what can they bring to the table to support better patient care. So those things I think are the most important indicators now of taking a step back and saying, how does everybody work together in the ecosystem? Because the data you have and the data I have may be drastically different on how we capture it, how we store it, how we share it. But together, along with someone else's data, they may give us really good insight from a patient's perspective. So that part's exciting, and I think one of the reasons investors are so bullish on medtech is because the ability to connect the devices they have, the technology they have, they live in a connected world already. Now the question is, how do we connect the world that they're in to the rest of the connected world? So that part's, I think, the most exciting thing for us.
I hadn't had a chance to lead through the report yet, you bring it up, we live in a connected world. And so I think we're ahead of where the FDA is from a reimbursement, from a approval, and then a payer perspective as well outside the FDA. And tech's going to lead, tech is going to be ahead, and how are people going to get paid on that in a connected world? Because it's not been addressed yet. But we're clearly adding value to the patient journey and the outcomes. Have you explored that in the report yet?
We have. So two components of that. One is, I think it's easy to say from the outside that the FDA is not ahead on the connected side. If you look at the stats in the report, I think there were 33 was the number AI algorithms approved by the FDA this year, which is more than twice last year, I think even more than that. So the FDA is actually in some cases pushing the industry, where historically it was the other way around. So on the technology side and the software side and the algorithm side, the FDA is where they need to be right now. But to your point, how do we create value from a reimbursement perspective? That's a much more difficult challenge. And I think it's the regulators, it's the payers, it's the providers, and it's manufacturers literally all have to sit in a room and figure out how that works. The good news is consumers are demanding it. And when consumers demand things, we can be a pretty powerful force. So the opportunity for the consumers to demand not only better healthcare, but better transparency in the system, better efficiency in the system, that's what will bring us to the table. So you're absolutely right, we're not completely there yet, but the super consumer will get us there, just like they have in retail, just like they have in transportation, just like they have in hospitality. That's why I think it's going to happen.
And I think you're right. I just don't know the timeline.
If you and I could predict that, that would be a different thing.
Right.
Yeah.
I can't play the market for the industry I'm in,
Right.
so SEC would be all over me.
Yeah, me too.
Right. Sorry, Mom.
Yeah.
The financing world, what I've noticed too is we do a lot of work in startups. And historically the financing world continues to be tight in the conventional sense. And for a long time, I thought it was unfair that biotech would get financing and arrangement on future value. And Medtech never did. Yet, I think with the entry of this data, that's going to change.
I think so. I think it's a change in a couple ways. I think you're not going to change the VC model and the financing model. They're still going to require what they require. So regardless of data or industry, it's going to be the same. But the risk profile and reimbursement, I think startup companies are much more attuned and aware of how to answer those questions early in the process and not wait till the end. They're also being pushed very significantly on what's your evidence? What are you going to give to the system, not just to yourself, and less about product features. So while the numbers in biotech aren't as big as in biotech, there's a lot of VC money going into medtech right now. And it's really, it was up 2% last year in total, but it was up 33% in early first and second stage companies. So, and to the tune of about 4.4 billion.
And what were the category? Did you recall what those categories were?
So the big categories were non-imaging diagnostics, obviously, which is the focus is on personalized medicine and patient intimacy. The second was imaging, and the third was cardiovascular. So the first two obviously tell you that where we're going from an industry perspective is let's focus on pre-disease, let's focus on treating you as an individual, let's focus on the behavioral health side of it. I mean, all those things are what's creating that draw for cash.
How does the consumer become a movement in driving that demand from a reimbursement perspective? And what responsibility do you think that the large medtech players who have been uber conservative in pushing DTC, direct to customer, right? Are you starting to see a little more? I see BSC, Boston Sci's got a couple things out now. Johnson & Johnson has got some DTC stuff out, specifically for the medtech industry. So there's a responsibility. How do we drive that awareness to the consumer?
Well, I think there's a couple ways to do it. One, if you look at the broader medtech industry, in certain therapy areas, the consumer, they're very direct. Diabetes is a perfect example of it. Diagnostics, very direct to consumer. I mean, you kind of need me to be a part of the equation when you're drawn blood and things like that. So I'd say there are areas where we have good experience and evidence of that, but to your point, more broadly, it's different. Now, where I see the changes are, I've got friends of mine whose parents have had knee replacements, and they're out doing research saying, which one do I want?
Give me a Makoplasty.
And yeah, right, and advocating to their physician saying, this is the model that which one are you using? And actually, just asking the questions and being informed and taking maybe that physician role less of an authority in a situation like that. Now, an acute event, obviously, it's a different ballgame. And more of a guide and understanding how long it's going to take me to rehabilitate and what's that process going to be. I think that's where the direct consumer, I think the consumers are running forward a little bit faster. And to your point, I think Medtech needs to match that speed, which is absolutely possible.
Look, they're used to it already. The aesthetic market is all DTC, whether it's cool
true.
sculpting,
Good point, yeah.
whether it's restoration robotics, whether it's LASIK surgery.
Sure.
They have been operating in a direct-to-consumer for a really long time.
Right.
And they still fall under the same, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, guidelines that the FDA would have
They
on.
do.
And so we know how to do it, yet for some reason, outside of aesthetics, a couple exceptions, Mako does it with the Mako.
Right.
We don't see that very often. I don't go down the street and look for a watch, although Boston Sci is advertising the watch right now, right?
Right.
And so there's a responsibility there, and I think that drives the change.
It does. It does, without a doubt. I think the other piece is, in the aesthetics world, it's a lot of private pay.
Yeah.
So if it's you and I in a transaction, I feel I'm much more directly connected to the control of that transaction. The rest of it, you talked about it earlier. The payers are in the mix. So I think the hurdles are going to be a little bit higher, but that doesn't mean we won't get to the end of the race.
Yeah, and that's very true. I mean, I had a massive procedure done, and what the doc wanted to give me, I did not agree with, because I was an educated consumer.
Yes.
And I drove, ultimately, what was put inside of me. Because, again, I knew what my choices were.
Right.
And you hear these CEOs talk about access. And I think we have to think of access as awareness. And I say that because we usually think of access of out of the way places, the outback, the middle of the country somewhere. But I think you don't know what access is if you're not aware of that product family or the potential solution. And building that awareness is critical.
No, it is. That's a really good point. And to be honest with you, I haven't thought about it in that context, because access is always volume driven, right? Let's be honest, and it's geographically driven. But the awareness piece, I think, is important. Now, how the medtech companies start talking about their products, similar to the way the pharma has done historically, are we looking at that? I don't know, to be quite honest. But I think it's, regardless of that, I still think the consumers, both individual and how payers and providers are helping them advocate and educating them. I mean, as you well know, you can't walk out of a doctor's visit or a hospital visit without 10 or 12 pages of interesting material that tells you a lot about what's going on. And if you haven't done the research before you walked in, and you actually take the time to read it, you're doing the research then. So I think there's just small things that will continue to move that forward.
Were there any categories or therapies or disease states that you see have a little bit more of a positive long tail moving forward? And again, I'm talking about either cardiology, oncology, neurology, or therapeutic that you think have, or the report says, have more promise than others?
Well, I think the big pieces on robotic surgery, non-imaging diagnostics, and some of those areas and the tools are probably the ones we focused on in the report. We don't view it by therapy area as much. Over the past few years, we spent a lot of time on cardiology and a lot of time on diabetes. We wanted to turn it a little bit on a different angle this time.
Nice.
So that's probably where we stand.
Yeah. Do you think that the robotic market with Auris all in over $6 billion, the Corindus deal, God bless them, 1.2. Those are definitely future value.
Yeah.
Do you think it's a frothy market, or do you think it's a deal like Instagram was for Facebook?
I think the long term, if you look at where minimally invasive is today, and then open surgery, and also the opportunity to where the surgery is actually being performed. Right? That's a part that people don't talk a lot about, and the ability to do that in other settings, in other care settings, in other ways. I think that market has a great long-term potential, but it's beyond just the tools and the robotic devices. It's all the data that comes into the actual procedure from the beginning and then after and all together. So I think you talk about people talking about the whole experience. Surgical robotics are a piece of it, and it's really how that spreads. And that's where I think the future is.
Yeah. And that bundling, does E&Y have any focus on realizing that power where the razor blade with, here's my J&J robot, by the way, here's the bundle you get with it?
Well, I think it's the bundle in my mind is more the data and the outcome. Right? It's less about bundling of all the other product pieces. Mm-hmm. Now, those may be business models that they're looking at. We're not aware of them. I can't really speak to that at this point. But I think it's really looking at, because reimbursement is going to a more value-based concept, that's one way to better connect the dots.
And here's the interesting thing is docs are always looking for evidence on robotic surgery, but you can't have evidence until you have enough robotic surgeries.
Yes.
And so that's the chicken and egg challenge we're in right now.
It is without a doubt.
Yeah, and that's going to take a lot of courage, and I think a generational transition. They're said that we're really not going to have that jump until we get through this generation of manual surgery.
Of surgeons.
Yes.
Right. I think that's fair.
Yeah.
I think that's a fair point. We had a panel today with John Liticote from Medtronic on it, who is a cardiothoracic surgeon. And he talked a little bit about, and this was new to me because obviously it's not my background, he talked about the fact that going from open surgery to minimally invasive surgery to then robotic surgery, where literally your hands and your head are down in the same place on the first two, but then it's up in the last one, is a big change. And it's a big change for the generational. So I think that's going to have to be a piece of it.
Yeah, so we're going to have to be patient there.
Oh, without a doubt.
Yeah.
Without a doubt.
And then finally, is there any space that the report called out that isn't so obvious today that you're keeping your eyes on, or E&Y's keeping their eyes on?
It's not as much of a space per se. It's really how fast and how cooperatively can we get connectivity in the ecosystem and interoperability. And it's really what we're trying to assess, and I'm sure others are as well, is how quickly will that adoption happen? How quickly will we break down the silos of data? And then turning pretty abruptly then into the value equation part of it. So, you've got some big major steps, and the question is, from a disruptive standpoint, which current companies or new ones are going to come into the mix and try and skip a step or two and end up where we need to be. So we're watching both inside the industry, that continuum, but then outside of who's thinking about some other ways of doing stuff.
Right, the data gods, right?
Yes.
The Apples,
absolutely.
the Amazons, the Samsungs, the Googles, right? So
they've got a bit of
experience.
firepower and experience.
And cash flow.
Yes, and with consumers too. So
that's very true.
Yeah,
that's very true. That's interesting. Well, I appreciate your time. I know you're super busy here.
Oh, it was great. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thanks.
So take care. Thanks, Joe.